This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is The Outer Limits, a television show from the 1960s that dealt with science fiction and horror, and I'll be speaking with Mitch Hadley about it. The Outer Limits was a 1960s television show. It was sort of an hour-long version of The Twilight Zone, though it focused a little bit more on horror and sci-fi. Mitch Hadley is back joining me to talk about The Outer Limits. So welcome, Mitch. For those of my viewers that don't know you, could you give a little bit of background about who you are, how you got into television historianism, and your opening shots about The Outer Limits?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back, Dan. It's good to see you again. I am a classic TV historian. I write about classic television and its relationship to American culture and American pop culture at itsabouttv.com. I also have a book out about the this relationship. It's called The Electronic Mirror, and that's available at Amazon. It's available online. You can email me if you're interested in it. But basically, what I take a look at is how American television reflects American culture, how it's gone to shape American culture and be shaped by it. Pop culture, history, all sorts of things that you don't necessarily think of when you just think of TV as something that you can turn on, watch, veg out, that kind of thing. So I think that television deserves a lot more respect from that standpoint. And, I was a child of television. I grew up watching it. So I spent way too many hours in front of the screen, I am sure. But this is something that I've observed over the years and something that I don't think is discussed as often as it should be. And so that brings us to a show that I think we also should pay more attention to on a serious basis, The Outer Limits. Some people think of it as a clone of The Twilight Zone. Understandable. They both came about around the same time. Twilight Zone was a little earlier. They're both in black and white. They're both roughly falling into the category of being science fiction shows. But beyond that, I think there are some key differences between the two. I think there's some reasons why we should be looking at The Outer Limits on its own and not compared to other shows. And I think those are some of the things we'll probably get into in this discussion.
So, other than being science fiction, both Outer Limits and The Twilight Zone, which is a bit more famous, were anthology television shows, and sort of like the variety shows of the same era, they've gone the way of the dinosaur. I mean, in the 1970s, you had The Love Boat and you had Fantasy Island, where guest stars would come, but that really wasn't an anthology in
Right.
a sense. So let's talk a little bit about anthology television in the 50s and the 60s and where this came from. As far as I know, the earliest anthology show that dealt with horror, the supernatural, was a thing called Tales of Tomorrow. Then there was
hmm
One Step Beyond, which came out about a year, 6 months to a year before Twilight Zone. And then these two, Twilight Zone and Outer Limits. Can you give a little background about anthologies in general and those within the science fiction realm?
Sure. Well, I think that for anthologies in general, one reason why they were so popular in the early years of television was because the headquarters for television was New York City. That was where most of the shows were done. That's where the networks had their headquarters, and it's where the early producers worked out of. And what you had in New York were Broadway actors, stage actors. You had this huge amount of talent available, hungry, up and coming stars who were looking for opportunities to be able to make an impact. And so you think of an actor like Paul Newman, for example, who did television before he broke into the movies, or you look at other actors who had been on stage. Ralph Bellamy, who had done a lot of work on Broadway before he got into TV. Uh, at the time, nobody really knew what was going to happen with TV. Nobody knew if it was going to be a success or not. A lot of stars thought that if they went on television, they'd be perceived as somehow slumming And of course, the studios didn't want their stars on television because it was a competitor if it succeeded. So as a result, you took a look at a lot of young actors and actresses who were looking for work, and they appeared a lot in these early anthologies. They built a reputation, a steady body of work. And so as television expanded, as it became more established. You saw the migration from New York to Hollywood. You saw more people willing to get into TV, and you saw the opportunities that stars had to really become successful on television. Then the anthologies started to drift away. It became a case of people wanting familiarity. It was almost, in a sense, the same way some professional sports build their leagues around stars, not around teams. So you have I Love Lucy. You have different shows where the attraction is the star. And it comes back to something I think Rod Serling said about The Twilight Zone, if we can just skip back to that for a minute. He did the pilot for the show with Earl Holliman. And one of the network executives said the problem was you show this and you say, wow, Earl Holliman's great. He's going to be on every week. But with an anthology, you say, wow, Earl Holliman was great, but he isn't going to be on next week. Somebody else is. So these anthology shows started to drift away as casting became more stable. But you're right. You had the Twilight Zone. You had the Outer Limits. One Step Beyond. There's another show I'm thinking of called Way Out that Roald Dahl, I believe, did, and that was not as successful. I think at that point in time it was being compared to the Twilight Zone, and it didn't stick around as long. But it's loved by people who watch it and enjoy it. It's a creepy type of a show, and it's got its own cult following. And there were shows like Suspense, Thriller.
Yeah, Boris
With,
Karloff.
yep, that they would dabble with horror and sci-fi elements. Even Hitchcock,
Yeah.
Alfred Hitchcock Presents, would occasionally get into the sci-fi element. But I think those shows depended more on mystery and outright horror in order to be able to make their mark. Whereas the Outer Limits kind of went right in between. It was a science fiction series. It was also a fantasy series. It also had the allegorical aspects that the Twilight Zone would have. But there were things about it that made it unique, different from these other shows.
Yeah. People talk about the Twilight Zone, and everyone, of course, knows the famous opening. Do 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 do. I actually prefer the first season's one, which was sort of like
Me too.
the harp, and I think it had a longer introduction. But the Outer Limits, along with a lot of the 1960s, which was littered with great theme songs, from the Hawaii Five-O theme to Gilligan's Island, Mission Impossible. But the Outer Limits has one of the more famous intros too, and I just want to read just a little bit of it. It actually breaks the fourth wall right at the beginning of every episode. It goes, "There is nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We are controlling transmission. If we wish to make it louder, we'll bring up the volume." And so on and so forth. It goes on for a long paragraph talking about controlling. You see all these images, which must have freaked people out back in the day, because a lot of youngsters, people under 30, probably didn't grow up with rabbit ears and shadows and the little grainy textures or whatnot. But back in the day, there in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was sometimes a gamble if you're going to get a television show, depending on the weather conditions. So if you talk a bit about, do you know why they did that and why it was such an effective opening?
I'm not sure exactly why they did it, but I do know that Leslie Stevens, who is the creator and one of the producers of The Outer Limits, had originally pitched the show with the title Please Stand By. And the network, I think that made the network kind of nervous for some of the reasons that you've mentioned. And they finally settled on the idea of The Outer Limits. But one of the reasons that is so effective is because it suggests this idea of this omniscient narrator. In fact, it was called the control
Yeah.
voice. And he was played, the voice of the control was Vic Perrin, who was a radio and TV character actor, very good actor. And he has a wonderful voice for this kind of thing. And he would come on after the opening credits, when the episode starts. He would present kind of an overview of the episode in much the same way that Serling would on The Twilight Zone. He would also return at the end of the episode when he would kind of present the moral of the story, and then he would conclude by saying, "We now return control of the television set to you." So I think that there was this idea that this show was being presented to you by some unearthly or extra earthly type of control. And that, I think, made it a very effective, otherworldly type of show.
Another major difference was most of the anthologies were half-hour anthologies.
Hmm.
Both Hitchcock and The Twilight Zone for a season or two went to an hour format, but I think they both reverted in the ends to half hours. This show was only on a couple of years, but it was an hour long. What were the pros and cons of that vis-a-vis these other anthologies?
Well, I think that one of the cons, if I could start with the con first, is that in the 50s and the early 60s, half-hour drama was a legitimate form of television show. You had a lot of half-hour dramas, and so in introducing an hour-long drama, especially in the anthology format, you were risking either having shows that were not tightly constructed or shows in which the audience was running the risk of losing interest as it went on. And for that reason, you had to kind of take a gamble. And the gamble was introducing something that would create tension and keep the audience interested for the entire hour. Now, in the case of the Twilight or of the Outer Limits, that gamble, if you will, was called The Bear. And The Bear was an introduction of the co producer of the show and the man who was really responsible for the first season of The Outer Limits, Joseph Stefano. And he described the bear as the one splendid, staggering, shuddering effect in a story that induces awe or wonder or terror. And the bear became the antagonist, if you will, the force that the characters in the story were up against. Occasionally, the bear might be for good. Most of the time, though, you think of the bear as being a bug-eyed monster or some kind of an extraterrestrial. Now, what this allows the show to do, the pro of having an hour-long show, is that it allowed the writers to go into a much more in-depth character study of the people in the show. It gave you the chance to build a multi-layered story with some subplots, with some very subtle notions of what's going on. And it made it a much more rich storytelling process, I think. One of the differences between The Outer Limits and some of these other shows is that the plots were very complex. And I don't mean they were complicated, but they were often dealing not only with the story itself, but they were dealing with human emotions. They were often dealing with the idea of humanity itself, what it meant to be a human being, what it meant to be human in the sense of humane. And it got into some very complex moral issues, ones that didn't always have an easy answer. So while you had the allegorical aspects of the show, it wasn't necessarily preachy. It was more presenting this to you as something for you to think on. And that's what I like about the show. And I think that's where the hour-long format really took hold, was in being able to get in depth on some of these things that defied easy expectation.
Um, One of the differences too between Twilight Zone and Outer Limits was I wrote a poem once called Aesop in a Modern Box about Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. It had that very Aesopian moral at the end where, Serling would intone at the end. And while you did have the slight intonation at the end of these, as you said, it was more open-ended. But uh, it's also where the old idea of the monster of the week format
Hmm.
comes up. And a lot of people who dismiss it or look at it as sort of a second or third rate Twilight Zone. Usually, Twilight Zone and Hitchcock are held up as the zenith of that era in anthologies, and people who sort of will slag on Outer Limits or One Step Beyond, do so with Outer Limits with the Monster of the Week format. You touched on it. Do you find that the weakest episodes sometimes are some of the silliest monsters? Because let's face it, some of the if you try to do it today, they look like Mardi
Yeah.
Gras costumes at best.
Yeah, it's amazing how so many of the monsters in these shows seem to have two arms and two legs, and they walk upright. And that's what is a little hard to take, I admit. I think that the most memorable episodes of the show were when you had these less defined monsters. Now, for example, you had the Xanti Misfits, which everybody probably would recognize by a picture, if not by the
Yeah.
title, but they were kind of these spider like creatures that had human faces or
I think they were
human-esque
more
faces.
ant-like. I think they were more like ants.
Yeah, yeah. That's a better description for it. But they defied the normal expectation of what a monster was going to look like.
Yeah.
You had other situations where you had one that looked more like it was coming out of a cloud. It was very subtle, and you had one where the creature was hard to define. You saw more like a disruption on the screen than anything else. But these were really effective. And I think perhaps the best example of this, one of my favorite episodes, and I think one of the most memorable episodes, it was called The Architects of Fear. And briefly, the Architects of Fear starred Robert Culp. Again, we talked about him on our show about Columbo. But
Right.
Robert Culp, just a terrific actor, and we really don't appreciate some of his work as much as we should. But the Architects of Fear was a story about scientists who came to an understanding of their own volition. They're making a decision that mankind will never become peaceable unless it is faced by a universal threat. In other words, a threat to the earth. This is the only way that mankind will ever pull together. Otherwise, we'll keep being torn apart by regional strifes. And so they draw straws. Culp draws the short straw. And what they're going to do is turn him into an alien monster based on some kind of a creature that they had gotten somehow from this planet that's thought not to be able to support life. It's a complicated story, but they start injecting him with different chemicals. They start training his body so that he's going to be, I think, breathing on nitrogen rather than oxygen. And you see the transformation of Culp as very subtly done. You never see the entire body at one time. You just see glimpses of it. You see the physicality of Culp as an actor, where he suggests the changes that are going on just by the way he's holding his body and the way he talks. And you don't really see the finished product until near the end of the show. But that finished product was so horrifying to people of the time, or it was thought to be so horrifying, that some of ABC's affiliates refused to show it.
Yeah.
And so what they did was they either blacked out the screen, they continued the audio, but they blacked out the video for the last part of the show where the creature was visible. And then they showed it after the 11 o'clock news in most of those markets. They'd show the picture of the creature. They'd show you what you had missed. But they were so afraid of the effect that it would have, especially on youngsters, that they would not show this creature on TV. And I think that when we look at it today, it's a very effective creature, but it's surely not the kind of creature that's going to give people nightmares. So I I think that the best episodes of the show are the ones that either present a creature that is not immediately recognizable as a human being, or some kind of a bear that poses an existential threat as much as a physical threat. You start to concentrate not on what the creature looks like, but what the creature represents.
Mm.
And those are particularly good, I think.
There was a comic book, a graphic novel that came out in the mid '80s called The Watchmen, or Watchmen.
Hmm.
I don't know if you know of that, but it had a similar. One of the major uh, arcs was that this former superhero becomes a villain, but he's trying to scare humanity and Russia and the U.S. To not have a nuclear conflict. So he creates this creature that
Hmm.
represents this existential threat, which is very similar to what you mentioned there. Let's talk about a few of some of the more famous episodes here, though. You mentioned this. Let's start with this Anti-Misfits. That, from what I was just looking, is considered one of the top 100 episodes of all time in American television. It's like the upper '90s, though. But so that had who is the actor who gets killed by them? The guy Bruce Dern, I think it is.
Yes,
Yeah,
I think you're
and
right.
I think he and his girlfriend are on the run. And the interesting thing is, it in a loose way, it sort of follows almost the Psycho kind of formula, in that you think it's going to be about him and her doing something and them being the bad guys, but boom, 20 minutes or so into the episode, Dern is killed off,
Hmm.
um, and the whole setup of it is that these are supposedly bad Xanties who are being exiled to Earth. Um,
Yeah, they're using Earth as a penal colony, essentially.
yeah, and do they end up nuking them in the end? I don't remember.
I'm trying to remember. I'm just looking at my notes. Yes, because what the Xanties say at the end, they thank the Earthlings for disposing of them because they were unable to do so themselves, and they are grateful to the Earthlings for having done it. But here's the kicker: the reason they chose Earth to exile their misfits to is because their study of history had shown that Earthlings were practiced executioners.
Yeah,
And so just when you think that you're helping them out, you're helping to save humanity, you find out the real reason you were chosen is because you're really good at killing.
yeah.
That's a twist that something. One thing I wanted to mention, just in passing on that, you talked about how this was kind of like Psycho, and what makes that interesting is that when we were talking about the origins of the show and Joe Stefano,
Yeah,
he had actually written the screenplay for Psycho. He'd
yeah.
worked with Hitchcock on Psycho, so he already had a background where he knew this kind of work that he wanted to do with the show. And it isn't surprising that he would introduce something like that as an element in the program.
So I want to talk about a couple of three other episodes that just come to my mind, and then we can talk about a few that you have noted.
Sure.
The first one, well, it's really two episodes, and it involves Harlan Ellison and his later lawsuit against James Cameron for the Terminator series. The first episode, I think, is called Soldier, about a
Yes.
soldier that goes back in time, uh, and or accidentally, and the second one is called Demon with a Glass Hand, which wherein a robe or a man with a glass hand, or maybe he's a cyborg or something, is looking for fingers that have to put on the glass hand to give him a sense of purpose or whatnot. And these two are considered, basic elements of what became the Terminator, the original Terminator movie, then the franchise. And I think it's Demon with a Glass Hand that has a very apocalyptic feel in terms of a computer system having done something wrong. So if you could talk about the two episodes and the whole shebang with Ellison and James Cameron.
Hmm. Well, robot, you're right. You're talking about two a soldier. I'm sorry. You're talking about two soldiers who were, as it turns out, born and bred, developed specifically to be fighting men. So they are, in a sense, they're machines, in that this is what they've been trained to do. They're operating kind of like the Terminators do. And they get caught in this time warp. One of them winds up uh, coming to Earth back in the year 1964. And he's discovered by an anthropologist. I think they look into him. He believes that he can be domesticated because he's very feral. When he's first discovered, they try to domesticate him. He starts to come along. We see that he still has some violent tendencies, but he becomes a friend of the family that's taking care of him. Then the second soldier comes in and tracks him down, and they have a fight. They're both killed in the process. We don't know whether the first soldier kills his opponent because he's the enemy or because he's trying to protect the family that took him in. That's one of those open-ended things. Did he do it because he was a born killer, or did he do it because of this altruistic admiration for his family on Earth? And that gets us to the tie-in with Ellison. And of course, surprise, surprise, when we're talking about Harlan Ellison, we're talking about a lawsuit. But the lawsuit that he specifically had said that the Terminator was developing two ideas that are in this episode. The first idea is that of a fighting machine going back in time. The second one is the idea of that machine giving his life in order that the family might be saved. I suppose we're not talking about the Terminator doing that. We're talking about the soldier that gets sent back in the Terminator. But Ellison thought that these were close enough to his own idea that they had to have come from it, and so he sued them. He sued James Cameron, and he sued the producers of the movie, and said, look, this is a rip off my idea. And they wound up settling and putting a credit in the credits for the video version, I think, of the Terminator that said something about inspired by the ideas of Harlan Ellison. When we look at the Demon with a Glass Hand, and I've just brought up a couple of notes on that one, it was another idea where Ellison had some of these concepts. And he specifically said about Demon with a Glass Hand that when he filed suit on this one, it was not because of any resemblance to Soldier. It was because of the resemblance to this. And this is another Robert Culp episode, by the way, which I find interesting. But you're right, this is somebody who's going back in time, sent to the past through a time mirror. He defeats all the people that are trying to hunt him down. Ellison says, hey, wait a minute, this looks familiar. And so he accused them of plagiarism. And I don't remember whether they achieved some kind of a settlement on this or not. What these show me, though, is a couple of things. One of them is that it's difficult to prove plagiarism with something like science fiction or fantasy, because you really are talking about the theater of the mind, and you can come up with these strange ideas, and they may or may not be similar to strange ideas somebody else has come up with. But the other thing that it does show is that Ellison had a relationship with the Outer Limits. He did one episode he did these two episodes. I don't think he had a relationship with the Twilight Zone. He did with Star Trek, and we know that resulted in another argument. He certainly must be one of the most contentious, talented writers out there.
Uh,
But it shows the great vividness of Ellison's imagination, too, and his ability to be able to not only take these as fantastic fantasies, sci-fi fantasies, but also to dig in again to the human element of it, which is so important in these Outer Limits stories that they become almost a character in the story itself.
um, one of the episodes that is not as well talked about because it goes against the grain is the only two-part episode uh,
Mm.
in this series. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's called Inheritors, and it's
Yes.
from
Uh huh.
Robert Duvall. Okay, so you know that one. That the twist is that the bear is actually good.
Yeah, exactly. And um, I agree. Not everybody is as bullish on this episode as you or I might be. You can find some Outer Limits critics who will point to this or that or the other as keeping it from being a great episode. I think it is a great episode, and for the reasons you talk about, that it is a total twist of the convention. That you find out the bear is a benevolent alien. In this case, we've got these soldiers who have been injured, presumably in Korea, unless they were more specific about it. Robert Duvall is the government man who is observing this. He's very good in this
Yeah,
episode too, by the way. At a time, there's another actor we should talk about as having cut his teeth in anthologies and other
yeah.
things in early television, but he was apt to be a heavy in a lot of these early shows, and he really isn't in this one. We have these soldiers who we think are being brainwashed to build this ship to be able to travel to meet this alien population. Are they going to take over the planet? Are they hostile? What's going on here? And they kidnap these children. These are either children with some kind of a physical handicap, children who might be developmentally disabled, or they are orphans. And
And,
as
and
you get through,
one other key point too is
Mhm.
it's one of the few instances in 1960s television. There are a couple of black children and I think one Asian or Hispanic child.
Yes, yes, and it's very interesting setup you get through the first part of this two-parter, and as you get through it, what you find out is these aliens, because of the air that they breathe, because of their environment, their atmosphere, and because of how advanced they are, they're able to heal these people.
Mm.
And they brought these children. And this is what I talk about when I admire the depth of these shows. They chose these children specifically because they were children who probably would not be missed and who had no real life on Earth. And what they're doing is taking them to heal them,
Mm.
to make them healthy and give them a life that they will be able to enjoy, and where they will be fully human. And at the end, the alien presents all this to Duvall. Duvall understands what's going on, and he tells these injured soldiers, I think it's up to them if they want to join this flight and live on this planet, and they choose to. And it is a very humane show as well as human. It shows a real depth, I think. And you're right, it's the only two-parter they ever did. It has great performances. It has Steve Einot, I believe, is one of the soldiers in this, and he had a reputation for playing heavies again.
Oh.
So he's kind of playing against type. But one of the things I was intrigued in reading about this episode after the fact was that he extemporized his climactic speech at the end of the episode based on the script, but put into his own words. And one of the other actors in the episode was talking about how the crew and the other people were just watching him transfixed by what he was doing with that talk, putting it into his own words. They were spellbound, I think she said. And not only is that a quality that would be rare for the kind of role that he plays, but it's also something I think that is striking in series television, that you have an actor who can do this, who's allowed to do this, and the impact that it makes. It shows how these actors really embraced the stories that they were in, as well as the production crew. But it's a memorable episode, memorable 2 episodes, and it just has an enormously humane payoff at the end.
The 1960s is when these shows aired. I'm wondering if that particular episode uh, got negative feedback because well, one of the soldiers that gets mind enhanced is also black, and I think one
Hmm.
is supposed to be Hispanic too. Is if there was a racial component because they were showing them as human beings that weren't
Yeah,
subservient.
yeah.
What was the major criticism then of that episode?
Well, I think there are some people who will point to it just as saying that some things don't hold together. Yeah, maybe that's true, but I think that particularly when you talk about the Outer Limits, and to a lesser extent to the Twilight Zone too, you kind of have to take some of the logic of the shows and throw that out in favor of the greater message. I hate using that word, but the message that the show presents of its humanity. In the case of the casting, that goes back to something Stefano had done in the first season, and this is a second season episode, I think. So he's left the show by then, but he had a practice of casting black actors even if the script did not specify that the role was a black role.
Mm.
If it didn't specify, he felt free to cast an actor who was black simply because it was an actor he wanted in the show, or an actor that he had worked with before. He mentions that as far as being a producer of the show, he was much more active in the casting process than a lot of them were. And the pushback he would receive from ABC, the network, was often in that realm. Well, why are you making him black if he doesn't have to be black?
Mm.
Or why are you making him an Asian if he doesn't have to be? And those were battles that Stefano was always able to win when he showed them the rough cut of the episode, and they saw that the power that was being generated by these performances. But again, you have to remember not only the racial component of it, but I think uh, I'm kind of going out on my own limb here, but the Outer Limits came during the Cold War. It came during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. All these things going on in the background, and if you want to substitute communists for aliens, if you want to take simply aliens as the idea of someone different from us, I think that there is a certain pushback that you receive from the suggestion that the people we perceive to be the bad guys might not be that bad. They might, in fact, be good. And that can be a very controversial idea. Flipping to just other genres for just a second, one of the problems with The Fugitive, when they introduced that got pushed back from the network because they were saying, surely you can't seriously be considering this idea that our hero is someone who is wrongly convicted by the government. What are the communists going to do with that? Suggesting that our justice system isn't can discriminate, isn't perfect, things like that. It sounds really strange to say today, but that was something they really had to work against at the time. This idea that The Fugitive was somehow anti-American,
Mm.
and I think that this is something that these shows run into as well. This concept that the others, are benevolent, are not to be feared, That's certainly a message that can be misunderstood during the Cold War.
The final show that I want to bring up, and then we'll go to some of the shows you might want to talk
Hmm.
about, is one that I think is maybe the only episode that has some real world impact culturally. Uh, and it goes to the UFO phenomenon. Now, in the late 40s, you had the first modern UFO sighting, you had the Roswell incident. Uh, and for the first 12, 15 years, if you watch TV talk shows like the David Susskind show, he'd have people who claimed that were brought on UFOs called
Hmm.
contactees. And most of the aliens were sort of like the day the Earth stood still, these tall Nordic type human looking beings that were going to save the world or whatnot. Then in the mid 60s, there came what was known as the Betty and Barney Hill UFO incident,
Yes.
where an interracial couple supposedly saw the now almost ubiquitous modern little gray aliens with the big black eyes. And one of the interesting things is, uh, I think it was a night or two before that supposed incident with Betty and Barney Hill, there was an episode on Outer Limits called the Bellerose Shield that aired, and people have seen a lot of similarities between the Hills story of a UFO abduction with the Bellerose Shield. Are you familiar with that episode?
It's been a while since I've seen it, so I'm
Yeah,
just going to kind of glance at my notes
yeah.
again on
It
this.
had
But
Martin Landau and Sally
mhm,
Kellerman.
Martin Landau, another terrific performance. He's got a couple in the Outer Limits that are great. But yeah, and it again presents an alien that is benevolent, that and you have it reminds me of what the day the Earth stood still. Is that the one with
Yeah,
Michael Rennie in it?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it kind of reminds me of that. That you have this woman who kills the alien,
Yeah.
and she has to deal with this tremendous remorse of having done that, and she's trapped by the shield, the imagined
Yeah.
shield of the topic. It was well, how did they describe that shield? Do you
Her own,
remember?
basically her own guilt, I think.
Yeah, that's what it turned out to be, and it winds up being this drop of the alien's blood that presumably is going to stain her pain forever. I
Yeah.
wrote down here, and that's you're right, and it's dealing with this metaphor, I think, of the alien, and again, it's starting to introduce these ideas of human guilt, of well, I think Stefano compared this to Macbeth.
Mm.
The where Lady Macbeth is constantly washing her hands, trying to rid herself of the guilt of the stain of the murder that she was involved in with her husband, and that's the kind of thing you're seeing played off here as well. It's a
Yeah,
brilliant idea.
and but for me, even more so than the episode, which is a good episode, is the cultural impact it had. Because people
Hmm.
will always say, oh, Madison Avenue isn't effective, commercials aren't effective, but here there are parallels between like a star map that's seen there and a star map that Betty Hill sees. The
Hmm.
wraparound eyes was the first time an alien was ever presented with wraparound eyes, and it just goes to show you that even something like you know a, a good solid episode of a mid-level show in terms of ratings, maybe even
Hmm.
Outer Limits wasn't even that popular. I'm not sure where it stood ratings wise, but you're still going to get 10, 15, 20 million people in those days watching this, and it has to
Yep.
have some psychological impact.
Well, and I think with that episode specifically, that's a great opportunity to introduce one of the real factors in the success of the show, and that's the cinematographer Conrad Hall.
Oh, okay.
Now, Hall had already had a successful career in the movies. He had worked in and would go on to work on some major movies. In Cold Blood, Cool Hand Luke, won 3 Academy Awards for, I think it was Butch Cassidy and American Beauty and Road to Perdition. But here he is working in television, and what he introduces into this episode, I think, is a great example of it. He has this kind of film noir mixed with German expressionism,
Mm.
and he's using shadows, he's using angles, he's doing all these things that are creating, as you pointed out, these iconic images that go on. And I think that this is a really good example of how something like that does become assimilated into the consciousness, because you don't have someone like Conrad Hall working on television.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that particular episode reminds me of the original Frankenstein movie from 1931, James Whale. Because when not the galaxy, but I forget what the alien is called, but when he first appears, the look on Landau's face, I'm thinking like the Dr. Frankenstein, it's alive, it's alive. You know, there's that sense that he's accomplished something, and then his wife fucks it all up.
Yeah. It's a great moment. It's a very good episode.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't make it on the top 10 list for everybody, but I think it's a very good episode.
Mitch, it's your turn now. If you have a handful, 3 or 4 episodes, whatever, that you want to hold up as exemplars of the Outer Limits, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think that the first season particularly is probably the best season of the series because Joe Stefano is involved in it. You have Dominic Frontieri, who is a magnificent composer, and his music is so atmospheric, so essential to the series in giving it that feel, along with Conrad Hall. And so, looking at the first season particularly, I mentioned the Architects of Fear earlier. I would recommend that not just because of its performances, not because of the subtlety of the transformation of Robert Culp's character. All that is good enough, but it also has as the backstory the inability of Culp and his wife to conceive a child. And just after he's made the commitment to go into this experiment, to be transformed into this alien who's meant to travel to the United Nations to show that the planet has to band together against this common threat, just after all of this has started, he finds out his wife is pregnant.
Mm.
And this is something he has longed for, to be able to pass on. And now he's found out that he will never see his unborn child. And yet his belief in this project and his commitment to it is such that even now he's not going to back away. He's not going to tell his wife what's going on. He has to pretend that he's been killed in some kind of a lab experiment in order to preserve his ability to be this alien. So he's willing to put his wife through all of this pain in order to achieve what he perceives as a greater goal. But it comes at a great cost to him as well. I think that's the kind of layered performance that I've been talking about, a layered story that deals with not just the sci-fi elements of it, not just the political elements of it, but the human element of it as well.
Yeah, and there was also another episode similar to that, a mutation episode. The guy who played Ilya Kuryakin on
yes,
the Sixth
David
Finger
McCallum.
or something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that. I think a lot of people are going to recognize that story too. It's, again, maybe not by the title. It's called The Sixth Finger, and it's about this illiterate laborer who undergoes this medical experiment where all of this knowledge is built into him. And as his brain becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, his head becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's the kind of thing that people probably remember it from. But it poses this question that as man accumulates knowledge, does he also accumulate wisdom? Does he learn how to use that knowledge in a wise and just way? And in becoming more and more intelligent, does he necessarily have to sacrifice his humanity in order to be able to do it? And it's a wonderful performance by him. I think that's one of those performances I look back on where where Stefano, as the writer, talks about um, how blown away he was by McCallum's ability to do what he did with the script.
Yeah.
And so that's an episode I think a lot of people will remember just from that visual. There's an episode that a lot of people don't like. I do. Stefano did too, but it's called A Feasibility Study. Sam Wanamaker is the star of it. And the gist of the feasibility study is that this neighborhood is taken from the Earth, transported to this alien planet. And what the aliens are trying to do, this is a case where they are very much the bad guys. They are looking for a slave population, and they are trying to figure out if human beings, if Earthlings, are a suitable slave population. And what it goes through various aspects of the show, but I think even the show's critics will say that it is at least partially redeemed by the ending. What happens is these people who've come from Earth find out that they will die if they are exposed to what it is that is infecting the people, the aliens on that planet. They will die if they are exposed to it. But the reason that they have been chosen and found suitable to be slaves is because they feel that Earthlings, again based on their observation, Earthlings will choose almost anything as opposed to death. They would rather be slaves than dead. Better red than dead. And what happens at the end of the episode, this tremendously moving scene where all of the Earthlings join hands together and voluntarily subject themselves to the exposure that they know is going to kill them, but is also going to convince the aliens that Earth is not the place they should go for these slaves. It shows them what Earthlings are really made of. And the music, the atmosphere, everything is tremendously moving because it's showing these people who will never be known. Their sacrifice will never be known by the people on Earth. Nobody will ever have any record of it. But they all unanimously and willingly decide to sacrifice their lives in order that the 3 billion people on Earth would live. And I think that's the kind of a payoff that is very unusual on television. So that's an episode I really like for its message as much as for its performance. I'm going to be writing about that in my next book, devoting a chapter to that episode. There's another Martin Landau episode too that I would recommend. It's called The Man Who Was Never Born. Okay. And it's with Shirley Knight. And if anything, I would have thought offhand this might have been the kind of a story that could bring up plagiarism with the Terminator, because it's another time travel story about a man who's sent back from the future to the past to prevent something from happening. And Shirley Knight is the Earthling. Martin Landau is the alien. There's a love story that becomes involved in it. She decides that she wants to accompany him back to his home planet after he has achieved his goal. But what happens is, in changing the past to prevent what they're trying to prevent by having sent him back, he has also prevented himself from ever being born.
Mm.
And so he fades away as the episode comes to a conclusion. She's left all alone in this spaceship that she doesn't know how to pilot on the way to a planet she isn't familiar with and to people who aren't like her. And, again, it's a very moving, very sad end. But when I watch it, I just conjure up the image of the enormity of space. And here you are, all alone in this spaceship, with the stars surrounding you and the planets ahead of you, and nothing else living for millions, billions of miles, and you're all alone there. And literally all alone. Not just that there's nobody with you, but there's nobody to guide you, there's nobody to be there with you to welcome you or anything like that. I don't use the word awesome very often, but if you want to understand the size of the universe, that is an awesome experience at the end of that episode. So, if you're looking for stories like that kind of touch on that existential or humanistic uh, thing, that I would encourage you to look at those. But there are other episodes. There's an episode with Donald Pleasance where he develops superhuman powers, and he has to resist the temptation to use them for his own satisfaction, to take it out on people who make him angry. And there's an episode called, what is it, the 10,000 Days of the Dragon, something like that. And that's a pure Cold War episode, if I can use that description, because it presupposes that the Chinese have developed a way to create, through plastic surgery and various other methods, a way to create a double of the man who is the leading candidate for the presidency, Sidney Blackburn. And so they create his double, they kill him, and they put the double in his place. And what he is designed to do as he wins the election and become president is introduce all of these ideas that are essentially appeasement to the Chinese. And what happens in this case is that it is his vice president who becomes suspicious of the way he is acting, and it introduces this idea that you're trying to convince friends or family or the leaders of the government that your president is not only not who he seems he isn't who he seems he is, but he's also working contrary to the interests of the country. That's a very provocative idea. It's kind of the Manchurian Candidate, but also 7 days in May. Do you have the right to overthrow what's supposedly the duly elected government? There's one final episode that I would mention, and this is one I've written about in my website, and it'll be in my next book too. It's called Obit, and it concerns this computer, a government project that has created this computer that is able to insinuate itself into your life so that it can see what you're doing, it can read your mind. It is totally invasive. And you have a United States senator who, as part of the committee that's overseeing the spending on this experiment, goes to investigate what's going on. I think they had a high suicide rate or something at the laboratory where they're working on this. And so it becomes a question of just how invasive should the government be allowed to be in your life. And it comes through that because the question is, should a machine that is that invasive be allowed to do what it does? You can look at some of the good that it would bring out, but is it offset by the bad that would bring out? Now, skip ahead 50 or 60 years and you look at your telephone that can tell people where you are, that can be used with various apps to tell if you've taken if you've taken vaccines, what your credit rate is, where what look it can look at all of your tweets, all of your emails. It can track where you are through GPS. It is a very contemporary idea of invasiveness, and it's being dealt with back in the early 60s as a question of whether or not this is something we should be suspicious of. And it's a very powerful episode as an allegory of what could happen in the future. Again, there may be people who don't care for the dramatic emphasis of it or the how the story is put together, but I find it very powerful from that standpoint. And I think to conclude with all of these wrap-ups, this is part of what I like about The Outer Limits, because unlike so many shows, it's willing to point out that the future is not necessarily better, that progress is not always for the good, that science isn't always right, and that in fact we should sometimes be suspicious of what scientists are trying to do because they've taken the authority upon themselves to do it. There are these things that are that go counter to the trend of what you often find in science fiction. They're anti-utopian in a way, and I find these cautionary episodes very refreshing because they really make you think about it. And I can picture people talking about it afterwards and weighing the pros and cons of each side, just as they would in The Prisoner years later, and wondering, is this the brave new world that we have to look forward to? The Twilight Zone does some of that, but on a per episode basis, I don't think there was any other series of that time that dealt with it like at The Outer Limits, and at the same time managed to be entertaining and to grab the viewer's attention.
Yeah, when you were talking about the feasibility study episode, I was thinking of the Monsters That Do on Maple Street episode from
Hmm.
Twilight Zone, which has sort of an opposite take in that the humans go down to their most base, worst level rather than their
Yes.
best. Um, do you know? I have read that, for example, Rod Serling was very encouraged by the fellow who did One Step Beyond. Did Serling ever comment on his views about the Outer Limits? Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of. I would never say that he did not, but I'm not aware that he did.
Um,
It could be that by that time, I think he was starting to ease back his involvement in the Twilight Zone, and he was looking on to more projects. He had The Loner, his Western with Lloyd Bridges, that he was starting to work on. So I'm not sure that it was ever on his radar screen to comment on, but
and
I could be wrong.
I mentioned Inheritors, the only two-part episode, because it was an anthology series. Were each episode's so-called fictive universes separate then, or was there ever any character or any mention of an episode in another episode? In other words, was this
Hmm.
what we now call, a cinematic universe, an episodic universe of its own, the Outer Limits, or was each episode self-contained?
Yeah, each episode was self-contained. I think that particularly in the Stefano episodes, you see certain characteristics that carry through in the stories that he wrote from a character development point of view and from a plot point of view. But as far as the universe point of view, they're all self-contained.
Uh, we had mentioned when we talked about Columbo how the second iteration of that show 20 years later didn't live up to the classic Columbo of the 1970s. Uh, Similarly, Twilight Zone had a lot of two or three iterations, not to mention the movie. And Outer Limits also came back once or twice. What were the
Yes.
fates of the later editions versus the earlier? And I only maybe seen literally two or three episodes of the later episodes. Were they just generally not as good?
Well, I think one of the positives of it, I haven't watched it either, so I'm really talking out of one end of my hat here. But I think the positive with it was that Leslie Stevens and Joseph Stefano, the two producers, were both involved in the remake of it, which was I think in 1995, and it they made a lot more episodes. It was the I think it ran for 7 years. Started on Showtime, and they did do a couple of remakes of old Outer Limits episodes. There's a certain continuity provided by having the involvement at the beginning of Stevens and Stefano, that you might have a commitment to quality. Having not having seen the episodes, I can't comment on that. But one of the things I will say is that, considering that it was on Showtime. Showtime was the one that created it, and it went into syndication. But being that it was on Showtime, they had the ability to deal with much more mature and adult subject matters that often involve nudity, and those were re-edited to go on the syndicated versions. So, I mean, if you're looking for an opportunity to see Alyssa Milano's naked breasts, don't watch the syndicated version. Watch the original version. But I would hesitate to say that's the only reason to watch the remake, because from what I understand, it has been well respected by many people. But besides being old school, I think that something that was essential to the old Outer Limits was the black and white nature of it. And they say that about the Twilight Zone too. And the expressionism, the noir, the shadows, the light and the dark, those are so much a part of the stories that we've talked about, that I think you've got different types of stories on the newer version. And I think it's one of those probably where your mileage may vary. I would not lump it in with the category of shows that are clearly dumbed down from the original. I think the new version can stand on its own, and it's probably best to be appreciated on its own rather than as a comparison to the Outer Limits. You may just be able to be confident that it's going to deal with some of the same issues, and it's going to come from the same sci-fi fantasy horror school, but it's not a continuation of the series. It might be an evolution of the series. It's probably more like a reboot of the series.
Just looking on the Wikipedia page for the Outer Limits, I didn't know this until I just glanced at it, that apparently Gene Roddenberry was often on the set of Outer Limits episodes, and he used a lot of actors from the Outer Limits, as well as, for example, it says the moving micro beast in the Probe episode of Outer Limits was then modified to become the Hoarder, the rock-eating beast.
That's right. I had forgotten that until you mentioned it. But you're right. He used some of the ideas. He used some of the props. When you talk about Soldier, I'm reminded of the episode of Star Trek that had um, Lou Antonio and Frank Gorshin in it, where they
Yeah,
were half black and half white.
yeah.
It's that same kind of struggle too. And I don't know whether Roddenberry or the Star Trek people were influenced by that idea of an eternal war between two sides or not. But that certainly shows how. That idea that the Outer Limits came on is one that's applicable to other forms as well.
Apparently, also in the episode "The Sixth Finger," the pointy ears used by David McCallum were
Oh, Spock.
yeah. Not the same thing, but the same process was
Uh,
used apparently.
I like that thought. I like to think that somewhere there was a Vulcan evolution involved in that. Maybe he was able to time travel himself to another planet for a short time.
So let's just talk about where the original classic series stands
Hmm.
today in the eyes of most cultural television historians. And do you think that anthology as a format is dead, or can it, in this environment with,
Hmm.
I mean, at work on lunch the other day, I saw something on Fox News called "Farmer Wants to Get Married." All these shows about, a farmer who has like 12 farm girls want to, and it's like, is there room today for something that at least tries to be intelligent like this?
Yeah, I think if you've got somebody like Jordan Peele, who has clout, who has name recognition, he can create an anthology like the reboot of the Twilight Zone because he can do it, and his name has the cachet that it will sell the series. But if you don't have that, I think it's really tough today to sell an anthology just on the merits of each individual show. As I say, we've become so attuned to star power in one way or another and building it around the stars of the show that if you don't have a creator who's a star, somebody of the magnitude of a Rod Serling back then, or an Orson Welles, or somebody who Steven Spielberg might be able to do an anthology series again, just because if Spielberg wants it, he can get it. But do we have that hungry young talent that used to be, when they used to work their way up from the stage to Broadway to television? You now have more access to stars in the movies, but I don't think they're willing to do one-offs. They'd be willing to do um, a limited series, and maybe that's it. It's something like, what's it, American Horror Story, where they do a different story every season. So you have the same cast within a limited season, but when the series returns for the next season, you have a new premise and a new cast. That might be the closest we'd get to a true anthology type of thing today.
And as far as the original series, is it looked back? I mean, it's not held in the same esteem as the
No.
Twilight Zone or even the original Star Trek, but it's still sort of as influential.
It has a devoted cult following, and you will find various writers, producers, directors who will mention that they have been influenced by it when they were growing up watching it, and or that they've seen an episode of it. So it still has a powerful influence on those people who have seen it. I would say, in that sense, its cultural influence is probably indirect rather than direct, in that today, unless you're part of that cult following, or unless you've been introduced to the series by someone like me who really wants you to watch it, unless you've seen it, you're probably influenced by those who were influenced by it rather than directly by the show itself.
Or if you've been abducted by gray-skinned, bug-eyed aliens who want to take your semen.
Yes, exactly.
But is there anything else you want to add before we end?
I would just say this, that the show is accessible. It's on DVD. It's on streaming services. Episodes of it are on YouTube. There's no reason not to see it if you haven't seen it, or if you want to go back and revisit it. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. If you want to give it a try out the first season especially, and those episodes that I have mentioned. You can watch them in any order because it's not a continuing serialization. So pick out some of those episodes that I've watched. If you like those, I think you're going to like the rest of the series.
Well, I will link to It's About TV. And how do you get that nice little graphic up in the corner there?
Well, Skype and PowerPoint can enable you to do some cool things once in a while. Even somebody like me can figure some of those things out
Okay,
once in a
well,
while. So,
I will link to It's About TV below. And thanks again, Mitch.
thank you very much, Dan. Look forward to the next time.